Mr. Rob Mali, the head of the Middle East Department in the International Center of Crisis.
International Crisis Group.
Crisis Group. You live now in DC. The headquarters of your famous institutions is in Brussels, but also you worked as an advisor to President Clinton. A lot of us who have been following what you have done or what you have written puts you as an expert in the Middle East issues. You are always here in the area meeting people. It's a good chance for me and our audience to speak with you and try to pick your brains and understand exactly your view about what's happening in 3 sections: the area, the world, and a focus on Egypt. Let me start with our major question. Now we had President Obama in his second term. How much the American president, when he wins his second term, is more free in making more constructive decisions in his foreign policy?
Thanks, and thank you very much for having me. You know, second term president is freer, but he's not entirely free. He's freer because obviously he doesn't have the constraints of re-election. He now is president and will never run for anything again in his life, and I'm sure he's grateful for that. And also he has more experience, and so whatever learning curve he had in the first 4 years, he now doesn't have to go through. But let's not kid ourselves, he's not entirely free. The American political system is such that there is a Congress that has strong views, there are other interest groups that have strong views, and the president also is part of a system that the American system doesn't move that quickly, so there's a certain inertia and certain constants in U.S. foreign policy. In particular, and I know in this region people care a lot, the strategic relationship with Israel won't change. It won't change with Obama, it didn't change before Obama, and it won't change after Obama. So there's some constants, but within those constants, second-term president has perhaps greater latitude, but I would warn against people in this region who tell me, oh, so now the president could do whatever he wants, he's going to help the Arabs, he's going to be much tougher with the Israelis. There is no precedent, really, no strong precedent of that happening. The more likely scenario is that the president will act roughly the way he did in the first term, and so if Palestinians in particular want to see a change in their condition, the responsibility is going to be theirs, and they shouldn't be simply waiting for the United States to change its posture.
It means the dreamers or the hopeful thinkers in the Middle East that they think that now when President Obama in his second term, he is more free, will be coming more harsher or more stronger on the Israeli policy. Even settlement, he can be more harsher, or still it will be the same issue. Israel is our ultimate friend. We have this special relationship with Israel, and we give always Israel the right to defend itself. And the maximum he can do that we try to help in mediation for a constructive, peaceful settlement, blah, 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 but nothing more than this.
I mean, there are many questions in your one question. The first point, as I say, if President Obama is suddenly much more engaged and much tougher with Israel, then the Palestinians could be grateful for that. But the more likely scenario, I believe, is that he will not be dramatically different, and that's why whenever I speak to my friends here in Palestine, I tell them, don't count on it. You'd be wasting you'd be living an illusion if you're counting on it. If it happens, your life will be easier. But the more likely scenario is that it doesn't happen, so take responsibility and act as if it were not going to happen. Now, you asked specific questions about whether he'll be tougher on settlements or not. Don't forget, President Obama was very tough on settlements at the very beginning of his first term. He called for a full settlement freeze. As he sees it, the whole thing exploded in his hands. He didn't get a settlement freeze. He alienated Netanyahu. Then he tried to get the Palestinians then he walked back his demand and he alienated the Palestinians. So at this point, I suspect the president has difficult relations with Netanyahu, but he also doesn't really believe that that President Abbas is somebody who's going to take great risks. So he needs better conviction on his part that if he gets involved, there's going to be a chance for success. He doesn't want to fail again. He definitely, on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, he knows that he didn't succeed in the first term. He doesn't want to repeat that experience. So I don't think he's going to go to war with Israel on the settlements issue. He might put pressure in some ways. He might see whether they can move towards a political agreement. But again, I don't expect that a president who is very smart, he looks at the landscape, and if he doesn't see that there's a real chance, I don't think he's going to take real political risk until he sees some changes on the ground.
In the priorities of this administration, in the foreign policy field, you have Russia, you have China, you have Iran, you have the European Union. Where is the Middle East?
Well, first of all, as you put it, the Middle East is not the number one priority of the administration. The Israeli-Palestinian issue is not the number one priority within the Middle East. I think that has to be... Now, the Middle East has a way, even when presidents want to move away from it, whether because they don't think it's important or because they think that it's not going to lead anywhere, they get dragged back in. I mean, Iran is clearly a very central issue for this administration because President Obama does not want to see confrontation. He gave one more effort at least at diplomacy. He still has to manage...
You can see he looks to the Middle East from the eyeglasses of the Iranian issue now?
Not only, I think the Iranian issue is a critical issue, but he looks at Syria, and Syria is not just an Iranian issue, it's also an issue that could affect Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, and Palestine. And he looks at the Palestinian issue. I'm convinced, and it's sometimes hard for me to convince my friends in the region, I'm convinced President Obama would like to do something on the Israeli-Palestinian front. I believe he profoundly is convinced that a peace settlement between Israelis and Palestinians would make a huge difference for America's image and for the stability in the region. But he also is not somebody who's going to throw the dice.
How is the chemistry between him and Bibi Netanyahu? Because I read several articles that it was not working well. It is not like some great relationships, Mother Golda Meir and Richard Nixon. It was a great chemistry going together.
It's not like President Clinton and Barack and Ehud Barak. It's not like President Bush and Ariel Sharon. This is not a state secret. They don't get along very well. But again, that doesn't mean that U.S. policy will be a reflection of the bilateral relationship between two men. Their relationship may not be good.
This happens between the Arabs or in the Middle East, where personal relation counts a lot.
Exactly.
But it counts in the American calculation, but not that much.
It counts, but it's not going to change. I mean, we just saw the war in Gaza. The U.S. policy was very clear that it said that Israel has a right to defend itself. It took position with Israel. The point I want to make is don't expect the U.S., whether it's President Obama or some other president, to suddenly become an unbiased mediator. You know what you get when you get the United States. You get a mediator that is closer to Israel. There is no question about it, and the Americans should never try to pretend the opposite. And for me, the question is not are they biased or not. Are we, the Americans, biased or unbiased? All presidents that I know and I think that will follow President Obama are biased because they have a special relationship with Israel, because the U.S. has all kinds of connections we could discuss. The question for me is not biased or unbiased.
This is a strong foundation, and despite who is the president or who is the administration. Okay.
The question
we should learn this also.
Can you be a biased mediator, but also an effective mediator? That's the question for me. It's not, forget about dreaming one day, maybe when I'm no longer on this earth, but dreaming of a U.S. that's going to be equidistant between the Palestinian position and the Israeli position. That's not, that's not going to happen. But can they be effective in producing a viable peace settlement? That's the question.
Okay. A very naive question. Does the American administration have a formulated policy towards the Middle East, or they are playing it day by day from hand to mouth?
Both. To some extent, I mean, there's always a strategy, there's certain interests, whether it's non-proliferation, counter-terrorism, so for Israel, stability in the region, access to oil. Those were constants. But in a region that has changed as much as it's changed since the last 2 years, one would have to be a super strategist not to be going day by day. Of course, the U.S. has to react to uprisings in Egypt, and then uprisings in Syria, uprising in Yemen, now what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Gaza. So in some ways, strategies are very useful, but they're confronted with the fact that every day in this region, and we could go, if we do the list of the weeks, and I'm sure you've done it on this show, It's extraordinary, from the war in Gaza to the ceasefire, to Palestine's admission to the UN, to the demonstrations here following the decision by the president, to what we're hearing in Syria. Every day is something that makes the headlines, which is one reason why I say the US can't disengage from the Middle East. But it's also a reason why one may suspect that there's this grand conspiracy on the part of the US. What it is ad hoc reactive policies to events that nobody can predict.
Okay, but for instance, do they know, and I don't want you to open the black box and tell me what is the secret, but do they know how they want to handle Iran? What is the at which extent there is diplomacy, and at which extent hell breaks loose and you start going to another option more than the economic sanctions, and more perhaps reaching some military operations?
Again, I have to say yes and no. Having been in an administration, I know that you may think you know what you're going to do, and then when you're faced with the decision, it's in the hands of the president, and who knows where he'll go. So you may have all these strategies, but when you're confronted with a decision, do I bomb Iran or not? Other calculations that you didn't expect come into mind. But the broad strokes of what the US wants to do with Iran, yes, I think it's known. President Obama would prefer to resolve this diplomatically. He thinks a war with Iran would be very costly for the US, very costly for Iran, and very costly for the stability of the region. So he would prefer not to do it, which is why I think over the next months we're going to see an effort by the US, by back channels, front channels, with other countries and alone, to see if they could reach a deal with Iran that would lessen America's concern about the nuclear program, and perhaps offer Iran some relief in terms of sanctions and relations with the rest of the world. That's the goal, and the president has been clear about it. But I also, he's also said that he won't allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, that he wants prevention and not containment. I'm not sure that's the right policy, by the way, but that's his policy. I'm not defending it, I'm explaining it. And I think at the point at which he believes he will no longer be able, if he waits, he won't be able to stop Iran if it were try to acquire a bomb, then he will consider a military strike.
I'm sure you read or you have seen Mr. Netanyahu's speech in the last General Assembly, where he got this famous cartoon board, and he said at this line, this is the efforts which is Iran doing for its atomic power, and here is the dividing line, this red line we will not permit. And he was marketing his efforts for having a military strike or whatever he can do to stop Iran from having this nuclear power or nuclear capability. Do you think the American administration joins Mr. Netanyahu in this assessment?
I don't think it's the Americans' line, and as you know, the US has said we don't want to draw a line. I mean, drawing a line is a very strange thing, because it means anything that Iran does that doesn't reach that line is okay, which I don't think is what Netanyahu meant. So the US has said we don't want to draw a line, but what they've also said is they don't want to allow Iran to acquire a bomb, and somewhere in between they will have to decide. President Obama will have two decisions. One, when has Iran's nuclear program reached the point where if it is not stopped, it can no longer be stopped? Whether they want to build a bomb or not, by the way, when they've reached the point that nobody can stop them if they decide to build a bomb, that's when he then has to make the second decision. Do I attack or do I not? He took off containment off the table. In my view, I have to say, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu achieved three big victories, even though people don't always recognize it. Number one, he made the Iranian issue the defining issue for the United States foreign policy, which is strange. I mean, Iran is not the biggest threat in my view. I mean, how big a country, how powerful a country, how could it threaten the U.S.? But partly because of Netanyahu.
And don't join borders with the United States.
Well, except that U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, so maybe they have
yes, but it's not Mexico or Canada.
No. So that was the first success. The second success is that he, again, not only Netanyahu, but now the United States' formal policy is not containment, prevention. Again, we're containing, Pakistan has a bomb, other countries have a bomb, and they're contained. or at least they're not attacked militarily. But in Iran, now that's off the table, which I think is a big achievement for Netanyahu. I'm not sure it was the right one, but it's an achievement. And the third achievement is he has put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict completely at the bottom of the ladder because Iran is so much more important.
There is this talk where it's not a secret that something is being cooked for a meeting for kind of diplomacy between Iranian representatives and American representatives. I don't know it's going to be on which level. The question is it time for a diplomatic solution or a diplomatic understanding, or it is just touching the water?
No, I think on the American side there's real seriousness. I don't know, I haven't been to Iran, so I don't know how they feel. I think it is time finally to have a real discussion about what Iran's interests, how far is it prepared to go to reassure the Americans about its nuclear program, what is U.S. policy in the region, is the U.S. prepared to acquiesce in an Iranian regional role? There are all these questions that they haven't been debating because they've been so focused on this P5+1, the 5 members of the Security Council, and Germany negotiating with Iran on the nuclear program. There are many more questions that have to be addressed if you really want to normalize relations between the U.S. and Iran, and maybe this is an opportunity to discuss those.
Okay, if there is this conspiratorial analysis that now the Americans are more ready to talk to sheikhs and imams and Muslim Brotherhood after 60 years of alienating them and dealing only with generals, do you think as chapter 2 in this policy that also we can talk to Iranians, mullahs, and we can start doing business with them if possible?
I mean, yes. First, I think on your broader point, I think the United States is paying the price of decades of ostracizing and ignoring and neglecting the Islamists, and so now they have to overcompensate because of all the lost time. So I think the perception by some in the region that why is the U.S. now so friendly with, as you say, the sheikhs and the imams, it's partly the price of what I think was a misguided policy for decades of saying we're not going to deal with them, we're not going to talk to them, we're going to have nothing to do with them. I think if you had had a more healthy relationship before with them, where you talk to them, you engage with them, you could disagree with them, today you also would have a healthier relationship, whereas now it looks to many in the region that the United States is running after them. So I think there's a lesson there. I think it was a mistake, in my view, and I've said this for many years, it was a mistake, whether it's in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamists in other countries, to simply say we're not going to have anything to do with you. Iran is a slightly different case. The United States has spoken to Iran many occasions, most recently again on the nuclear issue, and there were some direct talks, but also on Afghanistan. So there's no problem for the U.S. to speak to Iran. The problem
we hear there is also what they say security-backed channels, some understandings concerning Afghanistan, some and understanding Iraq, even concerning the situation with Hamas.
I don't think so, but you know, if it's secret, I don't know it, so okay. It's possible.
You've been to Israel and the Palestinian lands several times recently, and you have some fresh outlook about how is the situation there. You think now we are in the era of a long ceasefire, more the option of a long ceasefire, more than the option of 2 states?
That's a good question. I think the 2-state solution is swimming against the tide. It has almost everything against it. It has no emotional support on the part of Palestinians or Israelis. It has no strong backers regionally. I mean, you don't see countries that are really fighting for it. It doesn't have a project or means of getting there, and it has a history of disappointment. So President Abbas and what he represents is really swimming against a very strong current, and it's going to take a lot of effort by the United States and by others to revive it. The other current, the one that is in line with the current mood, is what you're talking about, which is arrangements between Gaza and Israel, and Gaza and Egypt, the West Bank and Israel, the West Bank and Jordan. That's some form of long-term coexistence which may be more realistic. It may be more in tune with the mood of the day because it entails no recognition of Israel, not touching the division of Jerusalem, not touching Israel as a Jewish state, which for Islamists is much easier.
In simple words, not touching the major issues of explosion.
Yes, but it's also a dangerous outcome because it doesn't resolve anything.
But you are delaying what cannot be delayed?
Well, I mean, we say it can be delayed. It's already been delayed for many, many decades, so maybe it can be delayed, but it doesn't resolve anything. It's not, I don't think it's good for Israel or for the Palestinians, but it may be the only realistic outcome now, because nobody is really fighting that I can see. I mean, President Abbas is a very lonely man right now.
Very lonely man, and also the American administration is not very happy with him. You can see this in the speech of Ambassador Rice immediately after the vote about having the status of an observer country.
I mean, you're right. There's some impatience with President Abbas, with Abu Mazen, because they feel like they've asked him to do several things. Go back to negotiations, he hasn't done it. Don't go to the UN, he has done it. So they feel they can't really trust him. But frankly, I have to say, and from an American administration that has to deal with its own politics, President Abbas is dealing with his own politics, and the notion of negotiations, the notion of continuing to cooperate with Israel, as you know very well, is extremely unpopular among Palestinians. He's the most moderate of the Palestinians.
Yes, because the question if the American administration and Israel cannot strike a deal while somebody like President Abbas, the moderate of all moderates, is there, whom are you going to do a deal with? Sometimes it looks like you like to deal with hawkish people. Perhaps they can finalize a deal.
Well, I don't know about the U.S. I do think there's a suspicion that from an Israeli perspective, they deal with those who can produce, who can deliver. Hamas could deliver the ceasefire. Hamas could do the exchange of prisoners. And so they look at President Abbas, who, as you say, is a much more peace-oriented and two-state solution-oriented, but they don't treat him that way. It
means the virus or the infection of the Arab Spring have moved from states to even the Palestinian issue. It means that now you are ready to deal even with political Islamic groups or like Hamas.
Not directly and not yet. I mean, I think you know, there's a big difference in the way the United States deals with... But
there is a kind of flirtation. It is starting now.
Listen, I think at some level it will be inevitable, because when you have the three of the major allies of the United States in the region, Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar, all three have good relations with the US, all three have good relations with Hamas. If you want to build a policy in the region that is coherent, ultimately I think the US is going to have to not deal with Hamas necessarily, but understand that Hamas has to have a role to play. Because otherwise it's a policy that is at war with itself. You talk to Egypt, you talk to Turkey, you talk to Qatar, you want to use them as partners, but on the other hand, you're not prepared to
use them as partners or brokers.
Either way, but as pillars of US policy, because the traditional pillars of US policy, President Mubarak's Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they no longer have the kind of, either they don't exist anymore, as in the Mubarak regime, or they don't have the kind of weight in the region that they used to have. So
or they have to decided to step back because they don't think this is the right bet to
and I think that's
or the right game to play.
That's possible. I think that's not excluded. Frankly, I prefer they step back than make a mistake, but the ideal is for them to intervene smartly. But if they're not going to intervene smartly, I think it's possible that they will step back if they decide there's nothing to be gained.
Now, the Arab Spring, this is my second...
I don't use that term, but you use it.
Or so-called Arab Spring, or Arab revolutions, or Arab uprising, or trying to revolt against traditional systems. I think the American administration, especially the Obama administration, was caught by surprise to see Tunisia, then Egypt, then. And they had a learning curve from the Tunisian experience, and they started to rectify it with Egypt, and they were very harsh on the Mubarak time. They did not give him any time in the 18 days, and then they had their bets for some time through the Pentagon with the generals in Egypt, and then they started criticizing, and then they have put in their bets, or favorably, if the Muslim Brotherhood are the winners, let's join the winners, under the pretext of if you can beat them, join them. Okay? Now, after something like 4 months in evaluating the Brotherhood in power, how do you think Washington is seeing this 4 months?
Well, I mean, first of all, I
With
think...
the pros and cons.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you describe U.S. policy, it was a work in progress. Again, partly was playing catch-up with a region that had moved much more quickly than the U.S. or others had seen, and playing catch-up with the fact that it had ignored a central actor, the Islamists, so they had to compensate for that. How do they evaluate the experience? Number one, I think you have to understand from the perspective of the administration, it's not like they had a choice. Who were they going to deal with? Either they dealt with Egypt, which meant dealing with the elected president of Egypt, or they dealt with no one. So, I understand the criticism, and I share some of it myself, of U.S. policy, but at the basic level, it's not as if the U.S. had the luxury of deciding we're not going to deal with the president.
No, I'm not blaming the U.S.
No, I understand. Some people do, not you.
No.
People do.
This is an elected president through an elected civilian ballots in a democratic way. This is the man who have been chosen democratically to be the president of this country, in spite of what ideas or party he represents. This I understand. You only deal with systems or democratic systems as you've been calling for the last 20 years. The question is, how do you evaluate the outcome or the performance of Dr. Morsi? The test for the administration, the big test was what happened in Gaza. And I think the lesson that they took from that episode was President Morsi is somebody who was very pragmatic, with whom they could work very effectively, who didn't put his ideological outlook above other considerations, who was obviously expressed his solidarity with the Palestinians and with the people of Gaza. He sent the prime minister and other things, but who also dealt with Israel and dealt with the U.S. So from that perspective, from a purely strategic national security point of view in the U.S., that relationship worked very well, extremely well. This is a point my colleague Hussein Aga and I wrote about this not long ago, where it's what we predicted would happen, because from the American side, what they're looking for at this point, despite the Arab uprisings, is relationships they can count on, that won't threaten the peace treaty with Israel, that will hold on to a certain view of the economy which is consistent with U.S. values, and that will act as a pragmatic broker in the case of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. That's what the U.S. expected. I suspect the Muslim Brotherhood here knew very well that's what the U.S. expected, and they were prepared to deliver it because their priority is domestic at this point. So they're prepared to make that trade. So from a U.S. perspective, on that level, it worked quite well. Means we are in the policy of you scratch my back, I scratch yours. If you
Isn't that the history of the region?
Oh, yes, but if you help me in Gaza, I'll close one eye on you might be doing unconstitutionally or undemocratic inside your country.
We could get into that. I'm not sure that they would agree with that characterization, but we can talk about that. I don't know that I will allow you to do what you do, but it's true that it does make it more difficult for the administration to rock the boat of the relationship with Egypt if Egypt is playing this role.
For instance, if this constitution declaration, the same constitution declaration which came 12 or 14 days ago, was just issued by the government of Iran. Iran. How would have been the American reaction? You would have seen the White House, you would have seen the president immediately getting out of his normal speech and giving a comment. You have seen the State Department, you've seen Mrs. Clinton, you are going to see the EC countries issuing a statement. Hell breaks loose.
If we want to start on the issue of double standards, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's not just that. I asked you if tomorrow there was an uprising in Saudi Arabia or in Jordan, or if the Palestinians were to rise up democratically, non-violently against the occupation, what would the U.S. do? Would it be calling for the ouster of King Abdullah or for the end of the occupation? I don't know. I mean, I have my own suspicion. But so, of course, this notion that the U.S. now is simply proceeding according to values and not according to interests is a myth. On all these issues, you're right. What Iran does, if Iran does it, it's unacceptable. What happens in Bahrain, the U.S. doesn't say that much. If it happens elsewhere, it does. But that's, let's be honest.
Because we are living under the magic spell of President Obama's speech in Cairo University at his first term. Unfortunately and naively enough, we believed every single word.
I'm sure you didn't. You're not that naive. So
No. I mean the people. We all thought this is a new chapter in the new look and the new approach of a balanced American administration towards the Middle East and Islam and what's happening in the area.
You know, I think people are often disillusioned by speeches which are not followed by results, and that was one. There were others, but I can't argue with
a lot of
fact.
Promises were broken
course,
in this speech.
I mean, I can't argue with that. But as I said, when I heard the speech, I didn't read it as a promise. I read it as an aspiration, but that's maybe because I'm more accustomed to the way people speak in my country. And I think what's happening now, again, I think people should be open-eyed. There's not a consistent policy across the region. So what you say about Egypt versus Iran, you could say about many other comparisons, many comparisons. It's the same, you know, but so don't expect from this administration or from another administration the kind of consistency that would be across the board despite what they consider to be or what the US considers to be its strategic interests. Maybe rightly or wrongly, they make many mistakes, don't get me wrong.
Okay. What is your special assessment to what is going wrong in the transition period of Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, even what's happening. Syria, let's leave Syria,
leave that for
but
now.
Libya. You have 4 examples in the Middle East which started a revolt against a system which they considered a dictatorship, and then now there is something wrong going on, and everybody is trying to make a diagnosis for where is the problem, where is the surgery should be done or the medicine which should be given. How do you see it from your point of view?
Let me give you at 2 levels. I think the first point is that these Arab uprisings, it's almost like a Russian doll. It's one element that's contained in another, contained in another, contained in another. There's at the basic level, there's an uprising by people against autocratic system, corruption, inequality. That's at the level, it's the fight of the people against their regime. But then there's a second level, of course, which is the fight among the people, whether it's for issues that have long been repressed, whether it's ethnic, whether it's Sunni Shia, whether it's geographic, whatever, whether it's Islamist secular. Those fights are taking place. At a third level, you have the proxy war that the region is waging between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others. On one side, Iran and maybe Hezbollah on the other, and that...
You have Lebanon, which really resembles this kind of...
yes, but now you're having it everywhere, so this proxy war. And you add to that, even to some extent, an international Cold War between the US and Russia, at least in the case of Syria. So you can't look at this as one dimension, which some people did at the beginning. They saw this only through the prism of the pristine, nice uprising, positive uprising. All these other elements have polluted it to some extent. So now there's nothing clean. Everything gets, and there still is that struggle, which is a worthy struggle, but there's been so many other elements. The other point about what's happening in Egypt and Tunisia, 2 countries I know relatively well, but we could speak about others. There have been long hidden issues, conflicts with identity. Again, Islamist versus non-Islamist, rural versus urban, territorial geographic when it comes to Tunisia. They were suppressed for many decades, and now they've come out in the open, and there's no mechanism, there's no agreed mechanism to resolve them. And that's very much the case here in Egypt. I think we see these conflicts that are coming to the fore, and there's no agreed mechanism to regulate them. So it leads to the kind of polarization and leads to the kind of what you're describing in terms of what looked very optimistic and now has taken on this character that I think many people are questioning. So, and if you look at, I mean, for me, the case here in Egypt is very much, there is a question, and I'm sure you could speak about it at much greater length. There's a basic disputes about identity of this country. and again, the Islamist secular or non-Islamist is one dimension. There are others.
You are riding one plane, but the passengers are divided about the final destination.
And so you have this issue, and one side, those who are now in power, the Islamists, are saying, let's let the popular will decide. Elections should decide where we're going to go. The other side is saying, no, we need to resolve this through some kind of consensus and some kind of values. One side is basically saying elections are everything, and they have to. My view is that the Muslim Brotherhood needs to understand that elections are not everything, and the opposition has to understand that elections are not nothing, that they do matter. And how do you find that balance between popular will, which has to express itself, but also give guarantees that in the long run you're not going to alienate minorities, or you're not going to alienate those who are of a different view. That's the challenge of all transitions, is finding enough guarantees for winners and losers so that elections can take place and they don't seem like an existential struggle each time they're waged.
Yes, but elections is not only free ballots or to just putting your vote in the box. Elections is an environment. It is kind of guarantees the right of media to put all ideas across, the right of debates, the right of everybody expressing his views. The constitutionally there is a kind of consensus on the major issues of constitution. How do you see this transition? You have a problem in Tunis about matter, and you have a problem in Egypt about that, and next month you have another problem in Libya about this matter.
No, I think that's right. If you look at not just these countries, but even the others in the region that have gone through democratic experiences and not always ended up well. Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, now Egypt. In all these cases you have unresolved fundamental questions. In Iraq, it's the balance between Sunni Shia and Arab Kurd. In Lebanon, it's the balance between Sunni Shia and Christian, but also the question of relations not with Israel and what is Lebanon's orientation. In Palestine, between Fatah and Hamas, it's ideological programs having to do with relations with Israel and security cooperation and their relations with one another. In all three, and now in Egypt, you've had elections before you reach basic understandings on the identity of the country. So the election becomes an existential battle. I think the better transition is to try to first resolve these fundamental questions, and then the elections become much less dangerous for whoever is going to lose. And so, I don't know how this issue here in Egypt is going to be.
What is the American administration if this democratic transition did not take place, and then you return back again that the solution is the army?
I don't think the United States would look at that very kindly, and I hope it doesn't get to that. I really hope it doesn't get to that. But as I say, and I've just been here for a few days, and I don't pretend to understand the ins and outs of what's happening. But the lesson I get from just being here since almost 5 days now is that for this to work, again, I think that the Muslim Brotherhood will need to understand that there's more to politics than an election. This is not. You can't simply have majoritarian democracy. Those who are the majority have to decide things, including the constitutional future of the country. But those in the opposition, I think they're equally at fault in that they are looking for what I would call democratic shortcuts. They're going to have to engage in the work of organizing and convincing the people, and they can't count on the judiciary stepping in, or the street stepping in, or the military stepping in, or outsiders stepping in. I call those shortcuts. They're not going to get what they want with that. So they're going to have to engage in the kind of politics that, as you said earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood has engaged in for tens and tens of years, of having roots, dealing with their constituency, trying to build real support. Until that's addressed, the opposition is not going to be able to succeed.
Okay, let me move to Syria. How do you define the double standards in how the Americans reacted concerning when there was the pattern of cruelty and civil war inside Libya and acting in different standards concerning Syria?
Again, I think the answer is this one is not only self-evident, but President Obama himself has been quite candid about it. So it's not. I'm not even trying to second guess it. Libya was an easy case. No real army, no real state, no country in the world that was prepared to back Colonel Gaddafi. He had isolated himself completely.
And it's an oil country.
I actually don't think that that's the main. I know some people disagree, but then you look at Syria. Because you could say Syria, the strategic interest is a tie between Syria and Iran, so you would have expected, as many in the U.S. are arguing for, that the U.S. should intervene there. But you have a real confessional divide. I mean, this is now a real civil war. It's not simply a matter of, as I said, of the people rising up. There's a sectarian dimension, a real army, not powerful by U.S. standards, but still powerful, and the risk that Syria could both implode and explode, and with consequences for all the neighboring countries, as you mentioned, Israel and the Palestinians, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq. And Libya has always Syria has always made it its expertise to export problems. It's always done that. And now it's both exporting and importing them because it's become an arena for this proxy war between Iran on one hand and Saudi Arabia and Qatar on the other. So it's not easy. The U.S. can't simply snap its fingers and resolve things. I don't want to defend what they've done. I think that there's a lot of criticism, but the difference for me is very straightforward. And my own view on Syria is what Syria needs is not a military solution, which was the case in Libya. And as I said, it wasn't even the ideal scenario for Libya as we see today. Things are not going all that swimmingly in Libya. But in Syria, a military solution will come at the expense, perhaps, of the very fabric and existence of Syria as a state.
Okay. How do you see your understanding the most solid possibilities which can come out? It means the best scenarios or the most serious scenario which can work out in the coming few months. The system is going to continue, or the Syria system is going to fall down, or an assassination from inside the Alawite sect, or the guy is going to have a safe exit agreement like the Yemeni president, or he's going to escape and elope and find refuge in outside country, or he will continue fighting until dying in his palace. What do you see is closer to reality or happening?
If some of those events were to happen, maybe, if he were to leave, if he were to agree to step down, all that would be probably preferable. And I think smart decision makers around the region and the world have to assume that this is not a regime that's going to be prepared to surrender, and that they will fight to the end, including if it means bringing not just Syria, but not just Damascus, but the whole country down, unless there's a politically negotiated settlement along the lines between then the envoy Kofi Annan and the Russians and the Americans and others, and now is being tried to be revived by Lakhdar Brahimi, with a very clear principle, which is, yes, militarily, the opposition ultimately will win. I think there's very little doubt that if this continues, at some point, the opposition will win. But at what price? For the
very heavy price.
At what price? So the better outcome is a negotiated settlement that preserves the structures of the state, preserves some elements of the regime, because you have to give them a sense that they don't have everything to lose. You need to point an exit for them where they feel like the Alawite community, people who are in the administration, people in the army are not going to all be either in prison or exiled or killed. You can't repeat Iraq and Syria.
Their own fulul, the Syrian fulul.
If you want to call them that. I don't particularly like that term. But
yes, you have to give them a kind of exit or guarantees.
Also, you need guarantees for those communities to feel deeply. It's an expression that, one of the expressions President Obama used, which I don't particularly like, which is, we have to be on the right side of history. I don't know what the right side of history is. When you have demonstrators here in Egypt, many Islamists and many who are non-Islamists, who was on the right side of history? In Syria, are the Alawites on the wrong side of history because they're Alawites? So I think it's not a matter of choosing. I mean, in the case of Syria, there needs to be a transition. Of course you need a different regime, of course, and as I say, it's going to happen sooner or later. but let's try to do it in a way that preserves as much of the country as possible, and as much of the structures of the state as possible. And it doesn't lead to the kind of all-out sectarian civil war which will make Iraq look like it was a picnic.
Could you explain why Putin and the Russian administration is playing this hard role in supporting the Assad regime?
Yeah, I think there are different dimensions to it. I think at one level, the Russians look at Syria through the lens of their own domestic politics, their fear of Islamism. And they are convinced that wherever the West intervenes, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, and wherever these kinds of changes take place, the Islamists and the jihadists rise. So I think we'd be wrong to neglect how powerful a factor it is in Russian decision making. That's number one. I think the Russians also fear chaos in the region in any event. They think that these kind of interventions end up being, or this kind of transitions can be chaotic. The Russians don't very much like the notion of outside interference in domestic affairs because they know that they could be next. You know, don't forget that there's been criticism of the way Putin was elected. And I think also they felt betrayed by what happened in Libya. And there's this strong sense among many in Russia, in the elite but not just, that the West systematically tries to elbow the Russians out, to trick them, and they're going to try to do the same in Syria. So they would, and so I think the Russians would prefer either a transition in which they have a real say, or keep things as they are, and if they collapse, it will be on the West's, it will be the West's fault, and they'll have to deal with the outcome. So I think there's some genuine reasons for why the Russians feel the way they do. Then they have their own other reasons, which are probably not quite as pretty. But I think if we want the Russians to be part of this, and I would much prefer that they be part of it, perhaps even Iran has to be part of it.
Perhaps they are using it as a kind of a trump card or a barter deal when they need something from the Americans?
Maybe, although I'm not sure. I don't know what else what they can get in exchange. Although obviously, if the relationship between Russia and the U.S. were better, maybe things would be better. But I don't expect that the Russians are going to suddenly shift.
Okay, under which point you think they will say, hands off Assad, we are not backing him anymore?
I don't know. I mean, you know, some people say they'll only do that when they think that he's going to fall. Other people I've heard say, even when they feel he's going to fall, they would prefer not to back away from him and just let the situation evolve. Frankly, I don't know. And again, I think rather than try to calculate when they're going to shift, I think a better approach is for the United States, as they're doing now with Lakhdar Brahimi, to try to work with the Russians to see if there's a way to engineer a negotiated transition. And as I was saying in the last question, maybe at some point you need to bring Iran in as well, because Iran also has.
Do you think this would be a point of on the agenda of the coming diplomatic negotiations between the Americans and Iranians soon?
I don't think the Americans want it. I think Iran wants it, and I'm not sure that the US will do in the end. And I'm not sure that it's going to happen soon enough, given how quickly the events shift.
Okay. Could you explain to me why President Obama did not give his full support to the Syrian Opposition Council? He said a statement which was not backing them and at the same time not recognizing them.
I think there still is some, I think they're going to recognize them. My guess in the next week or two they will. I think there's still some doubts about the representativity and the effectiveness of the opposition. And also some questions, what does it mean we recognize them, and then what does it mean we have to do? I think a better approach for the United States would be to, if they're going to recognize them, would be to try to get in exchange from the opposition some of the guarantees we're talking about what a transition would look like, a real political initiative.
Okay, the question is, does this council represent the fighting troops on the ground?
That's one of the questions the administration has. So far the answer is at best not entirely. It may be not much at all, but that's part of what is in doubt. And I think, again, I think they ultimately will support it more slowly than the opposition wants to. But, you know, the U.S. has been caught two logics. One logic is the opposition logic, or their opposition logic, of trying to beat the regime, topple the regime. And that has a certain, that's what the Saudis are doing, the Qataris are doing, the Turks to some extent. That's one logic. The other logic is of a negotiated transition where you have to deal with parts of the regime and the opposition. And I think the U.S. is sort of riding both horses. And that's why sometimes you have this impression of contradiction in the policy, because some days you think they're backing the opposition, they want the opposition to topple the regime, and that's when the tough rhetoric comes up. And other times you get the sense, well, no, they really want transition. And part of, as I say, part of the muddle comes, or part of the sense of lack of clarity comes from the fact that they're dancing on both dance floors at the same time.
My final question, because I have to ask you this question.
Yes.
You've been serving with President Clinton. President Clinton was one of the most significant presidents in the last era, in spite of a lot of judgments on him. But economy, foreign policy, I have achieved a lot of positive matters. He's a Democrat, and Obama is a Democrat. Both of them came from the street, okay? They worked from, you know, the very low stream until reached the highest official post, executive post in the country. Both of them are men of beliefs, men of principles. What is the difference between the two characters?
That's a difficult question to answer, and obviously I know President Clinton better than I know President Trump. We were at law school together, but I didn't get to know him as well. President Clinton is a real, deep down he's a politician. And you know it, and if you've met him, the minute you see him, he's a politician with all of the virtues and the vices that come with being a politician. I don't think Obama at heart is a politician. Obviously, he's a good enough politician to be elected twice to the presidency, so who am I to judge his political skills? But he's more cerebral. He's more...
what do you mean by cerebral?
He thinks more, and I don't say Clinton is not thinking, but he looks at issues. I think he tries to examine them in a very rational way. Sometimes people say, well, that's too cold, but I think he's very cautious in that way. He's not as people-oriented as President Clinton was. Again, that comes with many strengths, and I think many of the policies that President Obama has put in place have actually been have had quite success, but also comes with real drawbacks. But you know, no president is perfect, and I think we're going to judge now. I think the President Obama bequeathed to himself, he left to himself a number of issues that he managed during this first term, and that he's going to have to try to really resolve in the second. And the four that I think are absolutely critical. The Israeli-Palestinian, he has to decide, is this a conflict to manage or is it a conflict to be resolved? And each one entails different kind of political calculations. Iran, are we really prepared to put a real deal on the table, even if it means that Iran is going to have some nuclear program? Or are we going to have to go towards a real confrontation, sanctions, and military? Syria, what I was saying earlier, are we going to support the opposition in a way that hopefully will lead them, in their eyes, to topple the regime? Or are we prepared for some kind of negotiation? And finally, on the issue of the Arab uprisings, is there a consistent policy about promoting democracy, whether it's here, in Palestine, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, or is it more policy of doing ad hoc, case by case, based on, and those are four questions that, he's his own inheritor, which is the beauty of being reelected, but also the cost of being reelected, because whatever he left of unfinished business, he now has to finish it.
Mr. Mali, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.